Hello, everyone. When history rewrites itself, it rarely announces its arrival. It simply hands the pen to those who are brave enough to hold it. Today, that pen is in the hands of a young man from Burkina Faso, a captain, a leader, a visionary, Ibrahim Traore. This is not just a salute to a soldier, it's a recognition of a seismic shift, a shift in how leadership looks, how governance feels, and how courage acts under pressure. When we think about leadership, it's often in the context of stability, structured environments, predictable timelines, access to information, and resources on demand. But real leadership doesn't reveal itself in comfortable conditions. It's defined by how someone reacts when the situation is unstable, when every decision carries the weight of real consequences, and when uncertainty isn't an occasional visitor, but a constant companion. This is what leadership under pressure truly looks like, and it's where the distance between theory and action becomes incredibly clear. When a country is confronted with conflict, insecurity, and economic collapse, most people look for a way out. They want solutions, yes, but more than that, they want clarity. In the middle of chaos, the hunger for certainty becomes almost primal. That's the moment when leadership is tested, not by speeches, but by choices made with limited time and even fewer options. It's easy to underestimate how hard it is to make a decision when the data is incomplete, when the stakes are high, and when the outcome will affect millions of people who are depending on you. That's pressure. And it doesn't look like yelling or grand gestures. It looks like late nights. It looks like silence before big announcements. It looks like taking responsibility for things you can't fully control. That kind of pressure isolates leaders. It narrows the room around them until their next step feels like a calculation between survival and failure. But every once in a while, someone steps forward, not because they feel fully ready, but because no one else will. In those moments, leadership becomes a commitment, not a position. It becomes an exercise in endurance, and more than anything else, it becomes a reflection of how deeply a person is willing to invest in a future they may not even live to see. Leadership under pressure demands clarity of thought. It requires the ability to separate signal from noise, to decide what actually matters when everything feels urgent. That's a skill developed not in conference rooms, but in environments where real people are experiencing fear, loss, and fatigue. Leaders who thrive in pressure aren't just decision makers, they are listeners. They internalize the anxiety around them and then try to build something out of it. A plan, a path, or at least a small degree of momentum. But it's not just about making quick calls. Pressure demands long-term thinking even when short-term fixes are tempting. That's what makes it so difficult. The pressure to act now can often drown out the discipline to think ahead. A strong leader in this environment isn't just reacting. They are resisting the easy path in favor of something more sustainable, even if it's slower or unpopular. There's also the emotional cost. Most people underestimate just how psychologically draining it is to lead through crisis. You're never truly off. You carry the voices of thousands, maybe millions, inside your head with every step you take. You second guess even the right calls because pressure turns confidence into a scarce resource, and yet the expectation remains you must appear certain, you must remain calm, and you must never show that you're breaking. That's the burden. What separates true leaders under pressure is not that they have all the answers, but that they continue to search for them when the rest of the world has moved on. They don't let fatigue drive their decision making. They don't allow despair to take the wheel. They endure, not because it's easy, but because someone has to. This kind of leadership is rare, not because people lack intelligence or experience, but because it requires a kind of internal stillness. A quiet resilience that says, I know how bad this is, but I believe something better is possible, and I'm going to act as if that belief is enough to carry us forward. That's powerful, not because it guarantees success, but because it keeps hope in motion when everything else feels like it's standing still. Pressure creates a lens that shows us who someone really is, some crack under it. Some retreat, but a few, just a few, lean into it, they absorb it, and in doing so, they create space for progress to happen, even when progress feels impossible. That's what leadership under pressure is really about. Not the outcome, but the refusal to abandon the effort, not the certainty of results, but the consistency of courage. And in a world where the ground keeps shifting, that kind of leadership is not just admirable, it's essential. Courage is often talked about in personal terms, standing up for yourself, speaking truth to power, taking risks in your own life. But there's another kind of courage that operates on a very different level. It's the courage to challenge the architecture of global influence, the kind of courage that doesn't just navigate a system, but questions its legitimacy. This form of courage is complex, dangerous, and often misunderstood. Yet, it's the kind that ultimately reshapes the future, not just for one person or one nation, but for entire generations. When a leader decides to push back against the influence of powerful external forces, whether economic, military, or ideological, they're not just taking a political stance. They're putting everything on the line: their legitimacy, their safety, their country's stability. In many ways, it's the most high-risk form of leadership, because when you stand against a global power, you're not engaging in a fair contest. You're confronting institutions that have far more resources, much deeper networks, and decades of strategic experience. And yet, some leaders still choose to do it. The reasons why matter. Most of the time, this resistance doesn't come from a place of arrogance. It comes from a deeply felt understanding that continued dependency is not a long-term solution. There comes a moment in every nation's history when its people begin to ask who really benefits from the current structure. Are we making our own decisions, or are we simply executing someone else's playbook? That's where the courage begins, not with defiance, but with clarity, and then comes the harder part, action. It's one thing to identify that something's wrong. It's another to take the steps to change it, especially when those steps invite retaliation. Because when a small or developing country challenges larger global players, the response is rarely neutral. There are economic consequences, there are diplomatic consequences, sometimes there are even covert consequences. The risk is real. Still, leaders emerge who are willing to bear it. They do so not out of hostility, but out of responsibility, because they know that true sovereignty means being able to make decisions, even unpopular ones, without asking for permission. That's not just symbolic. It affects everything from how resources are managed to how foreign aid is negotiated to what kind of development models are pursued. And it forces a critical question: who gets to decide what progress looks like? Challenging global power doesn't mean rejecting international cooperation. It means setting boundaries. It means saying, we want partnership, not dependence. We want respect, not instruction. And those messages, while simple on the surface, tend to cause discomfort in places where power has long gone unchecked. That's why this kind of courage is often reframed as recklessness or inexperience. But in truth, it's usually the opposite. It's a strategic calculation made by someone who understands the stakes and decides to proceed anyway. It's also important to understand that courage against global powers isn't about isolationism. It's about recalibration. It's about creating a new starting point for negotiation, one where dignity and autonomy are part of the equation. Because when a nation constantly defers to external forces, even with good intentions, it begins to lose its sense of internal possibility. That's the silent cost of submission, the erosion of imagination, and courageous leadership seeks to restore that. There's a psychological layer to all of this as well. When a leader confronts a major global entity, it shifts the national mood. It tells people we are not too small to matter, we are not too weak to choose. That message, more than policy, more than reform, is often what ignites real change, because people don't just need food or safety. They need agency. They need to believe that their voice counts, that their identity isn't conditional on foreign validation. Courage against global powers, then, becomes not just a political act, but a cultural one. And like all meaningful acts of courage, it comes with a cost. Leaders who take this path are often vilified, misrepresented, or targeted. Some don't survive it politically. Some don't survive it at all. But what they leave behind is a blueprint. A statement that it's possible to resist overwhelming influence and still retain your voice. That matters, not just for the present, but for every generation that follows. In a world increasingly shaped by global interests, the individuals who dare to ask whose interests are doing more than resisting. They're reminding us of what self-determination looks like, and they're making space for a different kind of future. One built not on compliance, but on conviction, not on fear, but on the quiet, steady power of courage. Revolutions have never belonged to the comfortable. They start in the minds of those who feel the weight of inaction, who live with the consequences of broken systems, and who can no longer tolerate promises without results. And more often than not, the people leading these movements are young. Not because they are reckless or impulsive, but because they still believe the future is something they can shape rather than just inherit. Youth, in that sense, is not just a stage of life. It's a source of energy, clarity, and conviction that is uniquely suited for transformation. There's something powerful about being young in a world that tells you to wait your turn. Because when your turn never seems to come, you begin to question why the line exists at all. This isn't about disrespecting elders or ignoring history. It's about understanding that systems built for the past often don't serve the present. And if the next generation waits patiently for permission to lead, they may never get the chance. That's why so many revolutions, both political and cultural, are sparked by people who haven't yet been told what's impossible. Youth brings a kind of urgency that is hard to replicate later in life. It's the urgency of living in real time with the consequences of inaction. When a young person sees their country held back by corruption, violence, or inequality, they aren't reading about it in a report. They're living it every day. That closeness to the problem creates a kind of honesty in their response. They don't have the luxury of theoretical solutions. They need change now, and they're often willing to take personal risks to make it happen. But beyond urgency, youth brings vision, a fresh perspective, a refusal to believe that what has always been must always be. That refusal is incredibly powerful because it challenges one of the most dangerous ideas in the world, that the current way is the only way. Young revolutionaries see cracks in the system not as obstacles to avoid, but as places where light can get in, and that optimism, tempered with realism, is a driving force behind almost every meaningful movement in history. Still, it's important to recognize that youth-led revolutions aren't about chaos. They're not just acts of rebellion. The most effective ones are grounded in strategy, purpose, and a deep understanding of what's at stake. These are not naive idealists. They are often the most informed, the most connected, and the most innovative participants in political life. They use tools that previous generations never had access to: digital networks, decentralized platforms, global solidarity. They communicate at speed, organize with agility, and build influence before traditional institutions even realize what's happening. And perhaps most importantly, they do all of this while being told they are too young to lead. That contradiction creates pressure, but it also builds resilience. When someone fights not just for change, but also for the right to be taken seriously, they learn how to articulate their goals with clarity, defend their choices with facts, and turn dismissiveness into determination. There's also a deeper truth here that often gets overlooked. Youth doesn't last forever, so the window in which a person feels bold enough to challenge the world and free enough to try, without being tied down by obligations or theories limited. That's why young leaders act fast. They know that the longer they wait, the easier it becomes to accept what they once challenged. So when they see an opportunity, they take it, not out of impatience, but out of an understanding that revolutions don't schedule themselves. They happen when someone decides that now is better than never. Of course, not every youthful revolution succeeds. Some collapse under the weight of opposition. Others are co-opted or corrupted. But even when they fail to achieve all their goals, they leave behind something just as important, a cultural shift, a new sense of what is possible, and that shift can be just as valuable as policy reform because it redefines the expectations people have for themselves and their leaders. In a world that constantly demands experience, youth offers something else, clarity. While others debate, they act. While others defend the status quo, they challenge it. And while others wait for conditions to improve, they start building a better version themselves. That kind of thinking isn't reckless. It's necessary, because progress has never been about waiting for the perfect time. It's about recognizing that if the current generation doesn't lead, no one will. Revolution, when led by youth, is not the rejection of wisdom. It's the application of courage, and that courage, when directed toward justice, can transform not just institutions, but entire societies. Across the world, governance is often measured by how well institutions perform, how laws are enforced, how public services are delivered, how accountability is maintained. But these measurements don't always capture the deeper issue, whether governance reflects the identity, the needs, and the aspirations of the people it claims to serve. In many parts of Africa, this gap between governance and reality has become too large to ignore. What's emerging now is not just a reaction to that failure, but the beginning of something more important, a new model, one that doesn't copy external systems, but builds from within. For too long, governance in many African countries has been shaped by imported framework, structures that look good on paper, but often didn't fit the realities on the ground. These systems assumed that what worked elsewhere would work anywhere, as if culture, history, and lived experience were irrelevant variables. But they are not. In fact, they are the core of sustainable governance. And when they're ignored, the result is a fragile state, one that functions in name but struggles in practice. What's changing now is that a new generation of leaders is beginning to recognize that sovereignty isn't just about borders or flags. It's about control over decision making. It's about being able to define success on your own terms. That shift is not about closing off from the world. It's about rebalancing. It's about creating space for homegrown solutions to thrive, without having to constantly justify them to foreign powers or international institutions that may not understand the context. This new model of governance doesn't ask, how can we become more like established powers? It asks, how can we build systems that make sense for us? That question alone is a departure from the past. It requires humility, curiosity, and a willingness to unlearn decades of assumptions. It's not about rejecting everything external. It's about integrating what works with what's real. And that integration is where real innovation starts. One of the most striking features of this shift is the emphasis on dignity. People are no longer satisfied with stability that comes at the cost of self-respect. They want to be heard, they want to be part of shaping their country's future, and they want to see leaders who are accountable not to foreign donors, but to their own citizens. That expectation is reshaping how leaders operate. It's pushing governments to become more transparent, more responsive, and more locally grounded. Technology is accelerating this transformation. With better access to information, citizens are now able to question narratives that once went unchallenged. They can organize more quickly, share ideas across borders, and hold power to account in real time. That level of visibility is forcing a new kind of leadership, one that can't rely on old tactics of control or secrecy. The leaders who will succeed in this environment are those who see transparency not as a threat, but as a tool, not as a risk, but as a resource. Another important shift is economic. The traditional model of governance often prioritized foreign investment and aid as the primary engines of growth. But the new approach focuses more on self-reliance. That means investing in agriculture, in local industries, in regional trade, not just because it builds resilience, but because it builds pride. When people see value being created within their own communities, their belief in national potential grows. That belief is the foundation of legitimacy. Of course, none of this happens without conflict. When systems begin to change, the people who benefited from the old way of doing things often push back. That resistance can be loud, well-funded, and even violent, but the momentum is shifting. More people now believe that a better model is possible, and that belief is stronger than fear. It's not naive optimism. It's the result of lived experience, of seeing the cost of dependence and deciding that something else must be tried. The new model of African governance is not a single blueprint. It will look different from one country to the next. That's the point. It recognizes diversity not as a challenge to overcome, but as a strength to build from. It values independence not as isolation, but as a precondition for partnership. And most of all, it centers the idea that progress must reflect the voices of the people it's meant to serve. That's a profound change. Because when governance is rooted in reality, when it's aligned with the will of the people, and when it's fueled by dignity and vision rather than compliance and control, then it doesn't just become more effective. It becomes more meaningful, and in that meaning there's the potential for something that has been too rare for too long, lasting, inclusive, and homegrown progress. Vision is one of the most underestimated forces behind lasting change. It doesn't start with resources. It doesn't start with detailed plans or perfect timing. It starts with one person or a small group of people seeing something that doesn't yet exist and believing that it can. That belief is powerful not because it guarantees success, but because it reshapes how people approach problems. It challenges the assumption that the present defines the limits of what's possible, and that shift in mindset is often what separates those who react to the world from those who help remake it. When someone holds a vision, they're making a decision to think beyond the immediate. They're choosing to look past the obstacles in front of them and focus instead on what could be built in spite of them. That doesn't mean they're blind to reality. On the contrary, people with vision are usually more aware than most. They see the flaws clearly, they understand the risks. They're deeply familiar with how hard the road will be. But they move forward anyway because they're not motivated by how things are. They're driven by how things could become. That kind of thinking can be uncomfortable for people who are used to working within fixed systems. Vision disrupts the status quo. It invites questions. It demands change, and change, especially when it's bold or unfamiliar, tends to provoke resistance. But that's where vision gains its strength. It doesn't need universal approval. It needs conviction. It needs someone willing to absorb criticism, to endure setbacks, and to keep going when others stop watching. Some of the most important transformations in history didn't begin with a consensus. They began with individuals who saw clearly what was missing and had the patience to pursue it. Whether it's in science, health, education, technology, or governance, the story is almost always the same. Someone imagined a future that didn't yet exist, and they worked toward it long enough for others to start believing in it too. That ripple effect is what makes vision so powerful. It's contagious. Once people start to see the potential, it becomes harder to settle for anything less. But vision alone isn't enough. It has to be paired with discipline, with the willingness to put in the work every single day, even when progress feels invisible. People often think that vision means dreaming big and acting boldly, and yes, it does, but it also means listening carefully. It means knowing when to pivot, when to slow down, and when to keep pressing forward, even when momentum feels like it's slipping away. Vision without execution is just imagination, but vision with execution, that's how real change takes root. One of the hardest parts about holding a vision is the isolation that can come with it, especially early on, when the idea still feels abstract to most people. The burden of belief often falls on just a few shoulders. That isolation isn't a sign of failure, it's a test, and those who can carry their vision through that stage, through the uncertainty and doubt, are often the ones who are eventually able to build movements around it. Vision also requires trust, not just in oneself, but in others. No major accomplishment has ever been achieved alone. Leaders with vision understand the importance of building teams, of empowering others to take ownership, and of creating space for collaboration. They know that the path forward will be nonlinear, and that setbacks are inevitable. But they also understand that when people share a common purpose, they become more resilient. That shared belief becomes a kind of fuel, one that sustains momentum when other resources fall short. Another key element is timing. Vision isn't just about what needs to happen, but when it needs to happen. Sometimes the world isn't ready. Sometimes the infrastructure isn't there. But visionaries don't give up when the conditions aren't perfect. They adapt. They prepare, they plant the seeds so that when the moment comes, the groundwork has already been laid. In that way, vision isn't just about the future. It's about being ready for the future before it arrives. Ultimately, vision is not a luxury. It's a necessity, especially in environments where problems are deeply rooted and resources are limited. Vision becomes the first tool of progress. It creates alignment. It clarifies purpose, and it gives people a reason to keep moving forward, even when the destination is still out of sight. That's not a soft skill, that's leadership. And in a world full of complexity, division, and urgency, there's nothing more powerful than someone who can look at what is, imagine what could be, and act with enough courage to bring others along. So what are we left with? We're left with a leader who is not perfect, but persistent, a nation that is not rich, but resolute, and a future that is uncertain, but finally, once again, in the hands of the brave. Thank you.